Antra. Tai ne į mus kreipkitės, o į šitą konferentą atsirado reguliatorius didysis.
Ai, nemoku. Galėtų jis nesėdėt, kur aš jo nematau. O ir Venclova 10 minučių kalbės, dabar tik pamačiau.
Oi, bus.
Svarbiausia, Vanagaitė tik 3 maždaug. Nėra čia ko čia tau išsiplės, knygą parašėjai, užtenka.
Viskas. Taigi, gerbėmieji, ar...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Are we ready to start? If we are ready, may I ask you to remain quiet? Since there are quite a number of people at the synagogue, and it is still hot, and we still have coronavirus among us that is so dangerous to every one of us. So I'd like to ask you to follow all the recommendations, to keep the distance and to ask questions. And I strongly recommend to ask questions but not tell stories about your families. You should ask very specific questions instead. So we'll start from the author of the book. Professor Christoph Dieckmann will make a short presentation of his book, because many of you probably haven't read the book, but you will have an opportunity to read it only afterwards, later on. So the word of the author will be particularly interesting. I would like to add a few more words of why we have gathered at the synagogue, because there were a couple of remarks, and we also received criticism for this. This is not only a presentation of a book for the Jewish people. Our synagogue is open to everyone, and we kindly invite everyone to the synagogue. So that is a modest presentation, the very first presentation of the book. The author himself asked for a chamber environment, in chamber surroundings, so that we would have an opportunity to talk with each other, to communicate, to ask questions. All the further presentations will be organized in different locations, in different venues. Our community could not accommodate so many people in our premises. I see very few historians in the audience, but hopefully we'll see many more of them in later presentations, and many more representatives from the academic society. Today's agenda is as follows. First of all, Professor will present his book. Then we will talk to two very well-known, very prominent intellectuals whose opinion, both about the book and the past and today's life, is highly relevant to us. That is Professor Irena Veisaitė and Professor Tomas Venclova. And if Mr. Dieckmann agrees and allows for Rūta to say a couple of words, then we'll also have questions for the author from the audience. So any one of you is free to ask questions. So let us start from welcoming the author, thanking him for such a great opportunity and such a great gift for Vilnius, for the Jews in Vilnius. And I would like to express my gratitude to the author that he has chosen to present his book in the only active synagogue out of over 900 synagogues here in Vilnius. So the word goes to the author of the book. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Faina. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, thank you so much.
Aš norėčiau dar priminti.
I would like to remind, as far as the channels are concerned, you are provided with simultaneous interpretation. So channel number 1 is for Lithuanian, and the second channel is for English. So you can use the headsets and listen the presentation in the language you understand.
Does everybody have a headset now? Who needs one? Does everybody have a headset? Who needs one?
No, I think everybody.
Okay.
I just told which channel, which language.
Yeah. So, Arthur Bay, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts on our historiographical work, to discuss approaches, methods, and findings. I feel very honored to speak in the presence of all of you in this place. But let me mention explicitly Irina Vesaite and Thomas Wenslova. Thank you so much for being here with me, with us. And please allow me to mention somebody who I am missing here. Leonidas Donskis. This incredibly educated, most intelligent philosopher died in September 2016 at the age of 54. His early death has torn a hole in our social fabric, which can't be healed. I'm sure he would have been very much engaged in our debate about history and memory with his immense knowledge, his great generosity, his fantastic humor, and his ability, most important, to listen and to question. In the next 30 minutes or so, I would like to remind us very shortly what happened in Lithuania between 1941 and 44, of course with a focus on the Shoah. Then I will emphasize a few issues which might be important for our learning about this history. At least I'm trying to be aware of these issues while studying this history, and I hope my answers and deliberations in the book, How Did It Happen? Kaipte Įvyko, shows this awareness. We will have some time for questions, discussions after my dry methodological deliberations, presentations. No? Next picture. Ah, there you go. About 420,000 people fell victim to the German occupation. Wait, this is two, no? Yeah. Close to 200,000 Jews from Lithuania in the borders of 1941, plus 5,800 Jews from Germany, Austria, and France, which were deported to Lithuania and murdered. About 170,000 Soviet prisoners of war. And I would guess about 40,000 evacuated civilians from territories further east. And about 5,000 victims from diverse groups: Lithuanian, Polish, Russian civilians, Soviet activists, families of evacuated Soviet functionaries, civilian victims of German anti-partisan warfare, gypsies, and mentally disabled. These victims pose us the question, why were we murdered? And we try to answer this question. This somehow, yeah. Let us shortly run through the main stages of the Shoah in Lithuania. At the beginning, approximately 20,000 mainly Jewish men were killed during the first few weeks of the occupation, that is June, July 1941. 1,100 of them through pogroms. Over 18,000 were shot. Why have Rūta and I opted for the 25th of June to present the book. It was on the 25th of June 1941, 79 years ago, on the day where we find not only brutal anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish violence in Lithuania, but more. The Germans had managed to incite pogroms in Kaunas, where most of these 1,100 victims of the pogroms were murdered. Relatives of Irena Vesaita were murdered too. From 25th of June to 27th of June, 1941. After the initial wave of violence, of anti-Jewish violence and pogroms, the surviving Jewish population, mainly women, children, and elderly men, were to be squeezed in ghettos. As a result of this German policy, we find at the end of July, 4 weeks later, about 100 ghettos in the provinces all over Lithuania with about 90,000 Jews. In the provinces, outside the cities. It was still open what would happen to them. They were living in dire conditions. Their situation was sheer horror in July 41 already. At the end of July and beginning of August 1941, the Germans decided, for a variety of reasons, which we try to explain in the book, to kill all Jews in the provinces. Actually, don't need it now. Sorry. To kill all Jews in the provinces, those in the improvised provincial ghettos, to select the Jewish population in the cities, and to keep part of the Jews in ghettos for a short while as a forced labor force until Soviet prisoners of war, Poles or Lithuanians would overtake their jobs and replace them. Complete murder in the countryside, selection in the cities, ghettoization in the cities of the useful, only until a point of time when they could be replaced by either prisoners of war, Lithuanians or Poles. That was at that stage the German intention. We find 5 communities which were completely wiped out before the middle of August 1941. It's Plunge, Majeke, Birje, Linkuva, and Akmene. Starting at the end of July and throughout August, in an escalating and accelerating way, the provincial Jews were murdered in a coordinated effort by German and Lithuanian police. Coordinated effort. There are close to 240 mass graves, as you all know here, spread all over Lithuania. The police, which did the shooting here, was only the executive force here in a longer chain. Preparations for the killings were made by the other German and Lithuanian administrations in the villages, shtetls, counties, and cities. Starting in the very north, including Dwinsk, Dynaburg, in the Gebietskommissariat, the regional administrative unit, Šiauliai, then continuing to the Gebietskommissariat Kaunas and Vilnius in a chronological order also, mainly. Šiauliai, Kaunas, Vilnius, provinces. In the cities, huge selections took place during August and September 1941. As we all know, for example, over 11,000 Jews were murdered in Kaunas, over 33,000 Jews here in Vilnius, over 150,000 victims until the end of 1941. Since the Soviet prisoners of war died from hunger, exhaustion, diseases, and cold, the ghettos were actually bigger and remained longer in place than planned. The German need for labor is here the clue. The ghetto in Švenčionys existed until the end of March 1943, Vilnius until September 43, Šiauliai and Kaunas until July 44, the end of the German occupation. So that is the rough outline, chronological outline of what poses our problem. Oh, sorry? I don't really... Yes, this one. during my studying this, I came up with the idea of two triangles. Rūta told me, that's too complicated for the book. So I found this way of giving them to you, because they helped me a lot of understanding what I was trying to study. Two basic triangles might be useful, and I think, yes, they are useful as analytical tools to research and think about this history. What was the relation between the mass crimes, especially the Shoah, the conduct of war, and the occupation policy? How did these three fields influence each other? Why did I come up with this? Just one argument which is not in the notes, so the translators have to follow me now. The overall number of victims of Nazi mass crimes is about 13 million. 13 million people were murdered. Outside of battle, like in crimes. 13 million. Now, the chronology of this is as follows. Until 1939, the attack on Poland, the victims of Nazi crimes is very low, just a few thousand of people who were murdered. They were persecuted, discriminated, exploited, robbed, yes, but murdered only a few thousand, till 1939. The attack on Poland in 1939 through to 1941 changed this. Now we have an additional 200,000, mostly German victims, actually, victims of the euthanasia, of the killing of the mentally disabled. 70,000 until the summer of 1941, and the rest were against Poles, Jews in Poland. People were dying in the ghettos in Poland already from hunger and diseases in Warsaw. The overall number until June 41 is 200,000 over the next 2 years, from 39 to 41. So a few thousand, 200,000. And then from June 41 till spring 42, the number jumps to 3 million. All of a sudden, whoosh, high. Yeah? And mostly in the occupied territories. 3 million. And then the number from spring 1942 till 45 goes to 9 million. So it goes exponentially up. So from this simple chronology, we have a clear link between the attack on the Soviet Union and the state of the war and the occupation policy, because almost all of these crimes happened outside Germany. German Jews, as victims of Nazis, we have only 3% of the overall number of 5.8 million, we can sort of reliably say. Only 3%, 97% outside Germany. Yeah? And of these 79% of victims, 80% were in Eastern Europe. Soviet Union, in the borders of 41, Poland, Hungary, Romania. 80%. So this here actually is where it started, and it's one of the centers where the story developed. So the link between war, occupation, and mass crimes is, as a question, obvious from this simple chronology. Very often, the single fields are isolated from each other. And I believe we have to relate them to each other, and we try to do that in our talk in the book. So usually you find something about the occupation there, something on the war there, and something, okay, and there were crimes as well there. And I think we must link them in order to understand what was in the German mind at the time. Now, second triangle, the question of the relation between the Germans, Lithuanians, and Jews emphasizes an approach which reconstructs and analyzes the different perspectives of the most important acting groups. So we should try and understand the distinct logics which dominated the behavior of the different groups, which was not the same. Germans thought different than the Lithuanians than the Jews. And we don't have the Jews or the Lithuanians or the Germans. And here we also have to differentiate a whole lot. So I put this in quotation marks because, of course, we don't look at different ethnic groups here. Yeah? We are just allegedly looking at an inter-ethnic struggle. Yeah? But this is actually the Nazi perspective, as is Volkstumskämpfe. Yeah? which is not a good way to look at this analytically. I will return to that. But in this period, 1940s, ethnic nationalism was completely dominant in this time span, but it should not be our maßstab, our main category in the analysis of what happened, because the real history was much more complicated and differentiated than these collective singular images suggest. Now, it gets more complicated, I'm afraid. Both triangles were intertwined, yeah, and entangled. One cannot really analyze in a sufficient way the relations between warfare, occupation, and mass crimes without including the relations between German, Lithuanian, and Jews. And one cannot really study the relation between German, Lithuanian, and Jews without the context of war, occupation, and killings. Yeah? So I'm pleading to combine both triangles and the related questions and to study them on a quite broad empirical basis here. Broad empirical basis. I'm very happy that again with the help of Faina and the Goodwill Foundation, there is a translation of my long empirical study is on the way. It will take a few years, because I have written like 1,400 pages on that, to try to reconstruct and analyze in detail what has happened, and available only in Germany, and now a Lithuanian version is on the way and an English version as well. It will take another, I don't know, maybe 3 years till they will be published, but they will be available, and I'm very happy about that. It's 10 years after the first publication. Yeah. Further terms which have been crucial for our understanding and for my learning: power and choice, history instead of verdicts, we are historians, not judges, and finally one more possible trap of an analysis from the German side: we have to be aware of a colonial approach to this. Yet mostly the West has to be aware of a colonial approach here. Why doesn't this work really? Yeah, power related. Okay, there we have it. What has really advanced our analysis of power is to think power not as something that somebody has, as a kind of possession, as a constant attribute of somebody that somebody just has. No, but to understand power as an effect of relation between people and groups. If we think of power as a relational issue, not as something which, as a property, then we have to rearrange our approach to analyze power. We need to add to the top-down approach the bottom-up approach. Yeah? It is, for example, crucial to understand that in those 4 provincial districts of the German administration, the Gebietskommissariat, the district commanders, whose administrative forces were at first 22, later 25 county chiefs, all of them Lithuanians. So, in those, for one example, in the huge northern district of Šiauliai, where the first 60,000 Jews in the provinces were murdered, in Šiauliai, how many German administrators were there working at that point of time? 8. 8 German politicians. Yeah? When killing 60,000 Jews, and that is double the number of Babi Yar from the end of September, which was later also. In Vilna province, not in the city here, but in the Vilna province, how many people Germans do we have at the time of the killings? Politicians, 10. Yeah? And the executive force here, and the administrative force in the regions, in the local regions, were all related to the Lithuanian county chiefs. Germans did not have an administrative force beneath the Gebietskommissariat, except for some people for the agriculture, because exploiting the agriculture was very important, but this is actually not related directly to the murder. Meaning we must not ignore the levels of power where the actual implementation of politics took place. So even though on paper Lithuanians did not have many rights, yeah, they were just obligated to serve, so to speak. In practice, the Germans really needed their cooperation to achieve anything. And the Lithuanians would not be ready to act against most of their fellow Lithuanians in an ethnic sense. The Germans knew this and took this into account, into their considerations. Now, power and choice. To illustrate the concept of choice, let me use German historiography as an example. For quite a long time, the dominant picture of the Third Reich was that people just followed orders from above, top down. Hitler and a few other evil men had forced through orders everybody else to participate in violent crimes. Now, this simple picture of obedience and order and obedience was then challenged in the 1970s by the claim that anonymous structures and processes were more important than orders from above. Now, this time, with this approach, the people acting were not just obeying, but were characterized as mindless cogs in the wheels. Just opportunistic bureaucrats, technocrats, who did not really think about what they were doing in a complicated process. Now, both strands, just obeying orders, just functioning without thinking, do not really integrate into their models the notions of choice and responsibility of the society, groups and individuals involved in the mass crimes. Now, since the 1990s, the basic assumption has become stronger and stronger that each and everybody has, at least in some way, a choice of what to do, how to act and react in difficult situations. So what we see, we look at our history, is that people in the same or similar situations actually made different and diverse choices. There exists no determinism here or automatism of how people behaved or will behave. So part of our historiographical task as historians is then, which choice did Germans have at the time? Which choice did Lithuanians have at the time? And which choice did Jews have at the time? And to try and answer these questions, not by judgmental statements in hindsight, but to reconstruct and analyze the choices actually made at the time. Therefore, we do not know better in hindsight or pretend to be better people than the people 70, 80 years ago. We are not better than them. We don't know better. So what we try and analyze the range of choices they actually made, and analyzing and understanding these choices does not mean to justify the choices, does not mean to justify if I try to understand what any of these participants did. Yeah? It's the same as just as to compare different phenomena does not mean to equalize them. No. But to learn about the similarities and differences. Colonial approach. If we cannot study Lithuanian and Jewish history on the basis of sources in their own language, yet we is the sort of mostly Western historians, if we cannot study Lithuanian and Jewish history in their own language, we are endangered to repeat the perspective of the German occupiers. Why? Because we then rely on one-sided sources, for example, from the Gestapo, from the German security police, who take for reality what they have reported. And because of our basic assumption, German sources are reliable. We Germans are Prussians, it's always exact. Lithuanians, well, barbarians, not reliable. And Jewish sources, well, they have suffered so much subjective. Objective sources, German sources. That's our feeling, actually. Yeah? And it's a colonial approach. And if you look at it, I have to start to laugh, actually, when I think of all the examples where we have German sources are, of course, not objective. So all of these sources have to be scrutinized by our tools. Yeah? Possibly without prejudices. So A colonial notion is also present in the post-war assumption from today. We Germans are the best in learning about the past and in dealing with these memories. We are world champions in this. Yeah? Many people believe so, and we Germans, of course, like very much to have this connotation spread about us. Yeah? Oh, we are so good at dealing with our past. You might guess already that I do not quite agree with this notion. Let me explain what I mean using, firstly, the example of the German way of judging Auschwitz perpetrators. You find about 8,200 SS men and 200 SS women working in Auschwitz and the 40 camps, sub-camps of Auschwitz. 8,200. In the whole period, May 40 to January 45. The war survived of them 6,500. Now, how many of them were sentenced in court? In West Germany, 45. Yeah. Among them, 9 SS men were actually convicted of murder and sentenced to lifelong verdicts. 9 out of 6,500. East Germany, we find 12, and the highest number of convictions we have in Poland, about 670. Yeah? But that's the balance sheet here. We have the time for discussion later. Secondly, what is the German balance sheet of having our justice system dealing generally with Nazi perpetrators? So records, from the actual records, about 170,000 German defendants were subject to investigation. 170,000, it's a lot. Yeah? Now, in 2 periods, till 1958, we've had about 50,000, and then another systematic investigation was started, lasting till today. About 120,000 people were under investigation till 2005. And still, single cases are still there today. Against 10%, 17,000 were charges actually brought against. Against 14,000 of those 17,000, actual verdicts were passed. Only 6,600 were convicted. 11,147 of them of homicide. Yeah, and 1,147 of murder. Out of 170,000 who were brought to court, who were investigated against, just a tiny number. That is, and we are not aware of this actually, right? Oh, we Germans did a great job and still not. Look at the facts. Let's look at the facts and then try to contextualize what's happening. Now, another example, right? We can make, from historical studies, an informed guess on helpers and rescuers. Yeah, and generally, we can say that the percentage of helpers who took the risk to help victims is around 0.3% in average. 0.3%. Now, at the time, we have about 66 million Germans. Yeah, so we leave Austrians aside, Sudetendeutschen aside, 66 million Germans. Now, if we say 0.3 were involved in helping people, that number comes to about 200,000. 200,000 Germans were somehow involved in organizing, and Irena knows very well how many people it takes to save a single child. Yeah, there were a lot of people involved. So, 2019, last year, German people were asked, there were memory studies, we know that, and now from the people living today, one third, we have 80 million people in Germany today, and one third, that is about 27 million people, believe that their families were involved in rescuing people. Yeah? So we have 30,000 Jewish rescuers in Germany now. Now, whose ancestors were involved in these activities. Yeah? So it's 70% of the people today believe, my family, people I know, they were not involved with anything of the Nazi crimes. 2/3 with nothing to do with it. Yeah? And more than 1/3 even believe we were actually victimized by the Nazis, of Germans. 1/3. Yeah? So, and at the same time, almost half of the German population believe, Jews, you talk too much about the Shoah. Oh, yeah? Today, that's 2019. So, we Germans, as we've known always, we are collectively innocent, actually. Why am I telling you these findings? I really believe that we are dealing here with our common history. It is a history we can't understand in national or ethnic categories. It is mostly a truly European history and in many aspects even a global history. We are in this together as equal partners, and we all have enormous problems dealing with it. So this is not the German coming who knows how to do it, telling you the truth and leaving. We have common problems here, and we need to study this together. Yeah? There's no one up there and somebody down there. No, equal partners. This is very important. Now, good history is strong in asking questions and finding ways to pursue answers. We do not know the appropriate answers before we have looked at the evidence, at the widest possible range of sources. And from the sources, we build our evidence. We build our arguments out of the evidence based on sources. We try to present necessary arguments, and eventually we want to reach the stage of sufficient arguments. The important point here is that we are methodologically, not personally, as a method, we should be non-believers. We do not believe what we read, what we hear, unless we have checked it. We are 100% skeptical. You should not believe what I'm saying now, unless the evidence and the sources are persuasive. That is the Maßstab. If we agree on this way of historical craftsmanship, then we are not inclined to take part, or maybe less inclined, to take part in the game of what I would call identity politics. Then history is not just a quarry to exploit for our beliefs and needs. Then we know learning, getting historical knowledge, and arguments based on evidence, on sources, might run counter to our wishful thinking. And I'm saying this to all sides, to myself as well, all sides. It runs counter to our wishful thinking, runs counter to our expectations on what we might find. So the task of the historian is to do just what historians are supposed to do. Not to act as judges, but to look at the available sources to the best of our abilities and to try and reconstruct and analyze the history on the basis of the evidence. And to do that as balanced as possible in the hope that this might help to improve the empirical basis on which then the discussions can take place. So part of this historical analysis is the historization, to turn into history the terms as well as the concepts that we use to understand history. Now, for our discussion at this difficult past, the concept and the term of collaboration is, of course, crucial, as highly relevant. Where does this term come from? We use it like a daily language all the time. Where does it come from? The French word collaboration initially meant only, innocently, to work together. Yeah? When Marshal Philippe Pétain coined the slogan of collaboration, he was head of Vichy France, the not occupied parts of France in 1940, he wanted to explain the cooperation of the unoccupied parts of France with Nazi Germany. Yeah? And he coined the slogan of collaboration. The Vichy regime under Pétain believed that this formula of collaboration would open up some freedom of action to achieve a twofold aim, two aims here. At the one side, to preserve what was left of French sovereignty under the conditions of German dominance, and on the other side, to realize its own Revolution Nationale, which was deeply influenced by a right-wing Weltanschauung or worldview. Now, the aim of a Revolution Nationale had developed in pre-war times and strove to organize French society in a way which would overcome the effects of 1789, the French Revolution. Now the revolutionary slogan of 1789, we all know, is Liberté, Égalité and Fraternité. Liberty, equality and brotherhood. Yeah? This should be replaced now, yeah, because as conservatives and then fascists also by work, family and fatherland. Work, family and fatherland instead of liberty, equality and brotherhood. And so the faults of modern times, of modernity, were to be overcome by an authoritarian, anti-democratic regime which would avoid the alleged weaknesses of interwar France and create eventually a different modernity. It was not anti-murder. They wanted to create a different modernity. Now, the rapid defeat in spring 1940 by the German Wehrmacht, only 6 weeks, we are boosting with that till today, allegedly confirmed the weakness of the former French Republic. Yeah? So this means that French, Vichy France, had its own agenda, its own motives and goals, and it really pursued its own policy, even though the Germans had occupied part of the country and were in a dominant position. So when we look at other countries, not only at Lithuania, at other countries under German dominance or occupation, we find similar constellations. The non-German policy was often shaped by both experiences of the 1930s and expectations of how the war would go and end. The key words here is experiences and expectations. So who would dominate the next decades in Europe? Now, non-German policy was thus not only a reaction to German policy, but also influenced in its core by other experiences and expectations. Collaborators, what's the word? Anführung? Huh? In inverted commas, collaborators wanted to serve their own fatherland, to preserve what was left of its autonomy, and to prepare it for a better future in their eyes. That is the situation in the 40s. And then because of the defeat of the Germans, of us and our allies, and the extent of the mass crimes during World War II, the term collaboration, completely changed its meaning. It was turned around at the end of the war. Now then it turned into a highly pejorative term. Yeah? Meaning treason of the fatherland. Those people are traitors. Yeah? That's the opposite of serving your own country by being very good in tactics with the dominant Germans. And all of a sudden they turn, and they did it for the sake of the fatherland, of pro patria. Yeah? And now they said, no, you are traitors. Yeah? So collaboration and treason turned into synonyms. Resistance movements and the liberated states and peoples used this term to explain the recent past, to blame mostly others for what has happened and to make a new start after the war. Now, having collaborated meant having harmed the nation, and in many states trials were conducted under the accusation of collaboration, treason, having committed treason. Since then, we feel that all collaborators are to be seen as traitors, who were illoyal, have lost their honor as citizens of the nation. So I would claim that the term collaboration is not a useful analytical term anymore, but an instrument in judicial and political conflicts. If I term somebody collaboration, it has nothing to do with analysis, but with denunciation. It's just a political tool. Yeah? And I do not really see how we could successfully get this term out of this national post-war context of judging traitors in order to use it as an historiographical tool. So if you look at historiographical works on the reactions of non-Germans to German or Nazi policy, you see that there was no clear dichotomy. a simplistic division between cooperation with the enemy, collaboration, on one side and resistance on the other. Yeah? Do we assume that there's a clear cut between this and this, collaboration and resistance? No, all the different types of behavior, collaborationism is one of these terms, accommodation, attentisme, dissens, varied over time and depended on the specific context. The picture we get, if we look more closely at this, has many different facets and is quite complicated. Moreover, this is important, very often we find different elements at the same time. Elements of cooperation with the occupier, of agreement and consent coexist with element of resistance, dissens and distance. So we have all the different elements. Collaboration, agreement, consent coexisting with elements of resistance, dissens and distance. And all that, I repeat, is changed over time. 41-42 was very different from 43-44. Very different. Thus, the judicial context changed the meaning of the term collaboration. And I would claim that many terms, not only collaboration, but many other terms as well, and arguments we are using in historiography about the Shoah are essentially formed by the judicial context. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. I believe we should change that. Terms like perpetrators, bystanders, victims, intentionalism, all that stem from court situations. As if we are asking who is to blame, who is guilty and to what extent. And especially the blaming attitude is omnipresent. We do not take responsibility for our past, if we use these terms too much. Instead, we infantilize ourselves, prefer myth to truthful history, instrumentalize history for our alleged needs of identity politics. And we often use ethnic categories as analytical tools, which is a very dangerous trap. Instead of understanding our history in social and political terms and trying to analyze the development as they were, we see history as judgment day. Yeah? For our people, for our folk. Yeah? Ethnic categories are not helpful here. They actually repeat, to a certain extent, National Socialist thinking, as if history is by definition a battleground of our various people or Völker. Let me conclude. The global history of the Shoah is a problem of all of us. Germany carries the main responsibility. We carry the main responsibility without any serious doubt. At the same time, there are questions to ask. And we tend to believe that under an occupational regime, everything depends on the occupiers. This is a distorted picture. And we need to include all the occupied groups into our picture in a specific historical context. So thinking and explaining mass violence needs analysis of the whole society, not just a few allegedly bad people. A top-down approach needs to be complemented and corrected by a bottom-up approach. So we have to analyze complicated processes instead of simplistic cause and effect relations. Only then we might get nearer to what actually happened and why. So I would not single out Lithuania as so many do, because I know that the situation was not only in Lithuania like this, but in most European states and regions under German occupation, whether we look at Latvia, Estonia, Poland, France, Netherlands, Belgium, or the late occupied Hungary or Slovakia. The picture of deep involvement of non-Jewish perpetrators and non-German perpetrators against the local Jews is everywhere very disturbing. Very disturbing. In the context of non-German, non-Jewish cooperation with the Germans, this means the Shoah was a German initiative, but unfortunately executed with the help of very many. It turned into a European project. The Jews were trapped almost everywhere. And it is our task to discuss these questions and arguments, not in order to come to an end with it. In democratic civic societies, that is impossible to give one final answer, no. But in order to ask again and again and again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Dieckmann. Thank you for your presentation. It is now time for me as a moderator to ask a couple of questions. Maybe I would like to ask to explain a couple of things that we as non-historians don't really understand well. So I think that you have explained what history is, what analytical methods and principles you use, of how you analyzed and examined the documents and how you made the conclusions. You said a number of times that you are not a lawyer, but you are a historian. But I would like to say that I strongly believe that by making certain conclusions, a historian makes certain legal conclusions as well. And a lawyer cannot make a conclusion without the historical evidence or historical conclusions. So here is the point where I would like to contradict or object you. I really liked, and I really have read the book a couple of times. I'm not sure if any other book contained analysis of these two definitions, such as collaboration and cooperation. And Professor has pointed out, has drawn the attention to that term. I hope that you have noticed this and realized what meaning it has, how important for us it is, and what implications it has, how collaboration differs from cooperation. Professor did not mention many things that he writes in his book about. I mean, Juozas Krištaponis, that we are all so well aware of, but you talk about him in your book. That is the person who contributed to killings in Belarus, contributed to killings of Jews in Belarus, and the monument to him is built in Ukmergė, in the town where the heritage of Jewish, the way of Jewish heritage originated in Europe somehow. So you did not also mention Noreika in your speech now. That is a very controversial personality. You mentioned him in your book, where we understand his role very clearly. Everyone who will read the book will make their own conclusions. You did not mention Barzdo, who is also very well known to us, and we often talk about him, and there are lots of evidence and proof and about him. But you also mentioned him in your book, so we can all make our own conclusions. We can make our own conclusions, and we can make conclusions for the entire society. But the question that I have to you, but you also answered this question yourself in your book. What happened to those people who refused to shoot, to collaborate? And your answer was nothing. You only now said that it was their choice. But in the book, it is very clearly emphasized that this was a human choice. You did not mention now the period from 1940 to 1941, and I need to ask you about this, but I know your answer. That were a number of complaints from Lithuanians, ethnic Lithuanians, and not only Lithuanians, who had very little property, very little land, who were asking to take away the land from those who had more land. And you mentioned 200,000 of such complaints. Am I right? Yes. So this, and facts like this, are very interesting to us. My serious question is that I will come up later on, but now I have heard a question from the Israeli ambassador, why so few collaborators were punished, were convicted during the years of independent Lithuania. So I will quote you an answer which probably is known to Professor Dieckmann, and that is nothing new to us. In 1990, May the 8th, the Supreme Council of the Reconstituent Seimas on the genocide of the Jewish genocide during the Hitler years. The Jewish nation has been condemned to extortion, and I need to note, among the occupants and among the perpetrators, there were Lithuanian citizens. And there was no positive impact that was expected. But right after that, on the 2nd of May in 1991, I think, there was a law adopted on persons and reconstitution of the rights of those persons. How many? Do you know how many people appealed for this restitution of their rights? First of all, they started with 19,000, but in total there were 50,000 applications received. And only they appealed because the wrong process, the wrong trial process was used to prosecute them. And nobody really asked whether they were guilty or not for killing the Jews. And only after the letter to the Speaker of the then Parliament that was written by my father, the rehabilitation process was initiated, and it already takes place for 25 years. I'm not sure how many of those people who collaborated, who cooperated, or whatever we would call that process, were considered innocent. Now, Professor, I have a question to you that you haven't touched upon. That is impact of two institutions to the development of war and the killings of Jews. Maybe that is a very rough question, but I still want to ask you, what do you think about the interim government and the activities of the interim government in Lithuania? And although you are not a lawyer, but I still want your answer to the question whether interim government in Lithuania, which adopted certain legal acts, whether those legal acts were implemented, and whether that was a legislative institution or executive institution in a way. And I also have a question. What institution was active in Vilnius region which was even tougher against Jews than the interim government. And when it started its operations, when it completed its operations, when and why it operated, and what piece of legislation abolished the decisions of these two institutions, the one that was active in Vilnius region, and I mean the interim government of Lithuania. So could you tell us more about this?
Now or first,
As you want. Kaip, ponai, norit, ar būtų pirmas atsakymas, ar pirmas jūsų paklausimas? Atsakymo vis dėlto.
We still want an answer to...
There's so many questions touching so many topics. Let me start with the topic of historians as judges, giving kind of providing the basis for judgments. First remark I want to make here is that for a long time the historiographical categories we used and I mentioned as we obeyed only orders, or we didn't know what we were doing, we were just cogs in the wheel, were defense strategies in court. There were defense strategies in court from 1945 onwards. Courts by the Allies, and then after 48 also courts by the Germans. That's how people would defend themselves, and that's how they would get away with it. Yeah? They would say, we didn't have any choice here. Yeah? We had to do that. And if we hadn't obeyed, we would have been victims ourselves. Yeah? And now, to my knowledge and to knowledge of other historians, no German, or in this case Lithuanian shooter, was ever punished for saying, I don't want. I'd rather stay in the office, I'd rather go, I'd rather run away, I'd rather I want to shy away from this. I don't want to do that. No, they were not punished in any similar way than that they were shot or something. Some had problems in their group because they were weak. Yeah, they weren't decent men, no? Doing the necessary work for the fatherland, but they were weak. Yeah. So those people who were judged from the shooter, from the battalions, they were not judged for not saying, oh, we don't really like this work. No, when they were judged for excessive cruelty, or for taking things they were not supposed to take. Yeah, so we do have a few verdicts here, but basically we don't have not even one case with sufficient evidence. There are rumors everywhere, but rumors we don't take seriously. We investigate, and then if we can't prove them, we leave them on the side. So, this is one thing. There's a long tradition of deep entanglement of history and judiciary. Yeah? And I read, in my work for the long study, there were about 140 investigations against perpetrators in Lithuania, against Germans and Lithuanians, and in Germany. Yeah? And I looked at all of that, Yeah? Were hardly verdicts, but the material is there from the investigations against the killers, from the encounters from the Einsatzkommando 3, Operational Group 3. They investigated 17 years against these people, and they have 500. It took me 4 months just to read the whole thing from page 1 till page, I don't know, 50,000 or something. Yeah. So what do we learn there? And there, of course, there were historians involved. We have a lot of Gutachten, of how do you say Gutachten in English? A lot of they ask historians for advice. Now, what is this? What is this? What is this? A lot of very good people. But the questions these people ask then in their dossiers, is of course very different from a question I would ask. So when you ask me, give me a judgment on the provisional government being operational in Lithuania from 23rd of June till 5th of August 1941. I would say, which kind of judgment do you want? What are your sort of your categories here? What I would ask first is, what happened? What did they do? Why did they do it? In which context? And to get that straight, because very often we have our judgment ready before we even know what we're talking about. Yeah, and I'm very much in the position to say we don't close our eyes to things we don't like. For example, there's a constant debate about looking at Soviet crimes, looking at mass crimes. Yeah, or you cannot do that. Or like to ignore 40-41 and then only to start history in summer 41. And of course that is nonsense in any historiographical approach. We have to include the experience under the Soviets fully into the picture. And with which categories? Which experiences did people make? Which expectations did they have? Which choices did they have at the time? Yeah? You mentioned the many poor peasants, yeah, who said, okay, now the Soviets are here, and now we're going to arrange with them. Yeah? We will try and get a larger plot, 200,000 applications, and I know all that from Lithuanian historiography. I didn't research Soviet times myself. Yeah? From Truska, and all the other wonderful Lithuanian historians. I read their work. So before we start any judgments, let's read. Let's study, let's gain knowledge. This is very important for me. So, and I am very much in favor of an inclusive approach. So if you ask me for a judgment, I want to know precisely your question. Yeah? I want to know precisely the question. And then we can debate that. Which ways do we have to pursue this question? That would be my answer. Yeah? What I'm very strongly emphasizing, I have tried to do that several times today as well, is history is not judgment day about the character of a certain people. It is not. Yeah? All of us, we talk about gray, yeah? in the book a lot. That's why the whole book is gray. Yeah? They are not the white people and the black people here. No, it's all gray, and we have to be precise in what we look at. So, when the debate about single people, Christoponis, Noreika, Barsta, those people we assume, they were real perpetrators. Huh? First thing we do is gather as much evidence as we can, and then evaluate that, and then see which questions do we want to answer here. Which questions do we want to answer here? Now, if we want a society which uses history for identity politics. We don't have questions, we only have answers. If we have ethnic identity politics history, then we go for heroes and victims. We suffered so much, and we had heroes as well. Yeah? It's a boring story, always the same. It's a boring story, always the same. And we know the answers before we even have started investigating. Yeah? And then, I would, this is sort of, I kind of shy away from clear answers and go to the method again. Yeah? But this is necessary, because this is where we are not good at. We debate without knowing what we are actually talking about. Yeah? So that's why I'm so happy that the long study is translated as well. Yeah? I'm happy about this one, the short version. Yeah? But what you find here in a very short version is then more extensively in the longer study as well, and then based on much more sources. Yeah? And here it's very important to include all the various languages and perspectives over time. Yeah? There wasn't only the provisional government, you mentioned that, in Kaunas, which we debate so much, because on paper this was still an independent acting legal body. There was no connection to Vilna at the time. Vilna had its citizen committee. Here, the Kaunas provisional government was not relevant. Yeah? Because there was no contact. Yeah? It was a different army, German army command here, different people acting, and Vilna by itself has a very different history. Yeah? So if we talk about the provisional government, please let's talk about the citizen committee as well, yeah? Which was more radical, yeah? basically the same people, sort of the same kind of people acting. Yeah? And here, very important is, and we forget, we're not talking about the Lithuanians acting here. We're talking very much about a certain generation of conservatives, the young conservatives who were so disappointed about their elderly, that they said, this time we're going to make it right. And young fascists. And Noreika was one of those enthusiastic young fascists already from the early 30s, yeah, who had a vision of how to heal Lithuania, how to turn it into a strong, healthy country, and with a certain analysis of what is wrong here. And what is wrong? The minorities are too strong, and the Jewish question is not the same as a minority question. Anti-Semitism is much more than that. It's not just like a Polish minority or a Russian minority or a German minority. Jews are dangerous. Anti-Semites believe Jews are powerful and they are behind things we don't understand. And basically, I mentioned this modernity problem. Jews are actually the ones to blame for the faults of what is wrong in modern times. And so in all cases, even if we don't have a proper solution for the minority case, for the minority problems, with the Jews we have to be very strict in order to build a healthy society. Yeah? They have to somehow disappear. At certain points this then turned into murder, but only at a certain point, and that was a German initiative, not a non-German initiative. As I said again, we have one Lithuanian county chief, police county chief, Audronis in Alytus, where we have the document asking the Germans, give me a few days, I have 800 people here and we're going to solve the Jewish question by murdering them. And the Germans said, no, what are you doing? No, we are the bosses here. And then in several waves, Jews in County Alytus were murdered then later. Yeah? So here where the Germans could have jumped on, oh yes, thanks for offering your help. Yeah? Said, no, what do you want? Yeah? No, we do that. So this is very important for this discussion. Okay? For them. Thanks.
Okay, yes. Oh, it's yours. Ponia Irena, jūs išgyvenote daug.
Mrs. Irena, you have survived a number of regimes in Lithuania. You were born in pre-war Lithuania, in the so-called bourgeois Lithuania. Then you survived the Soviet occupation, then you survived the Holocaust, Soviet occupation again. You lost two families, the Jewish one and the Lithuanian one. You suffered both from shore and exile to gulags. And you probably read this book. Yes, I did. What would you like to tell the audience here? First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for this book. It was very interesting for me to read it because it's based on facts. It does not judge. It clearly shows that the shore was the German initiative. And I deeply value Professor Dieckmann's and Rūta's work. This book is extremely important, and I hope that a lot of people will read it. I'm a witness of all these events, and what I want to tell you is that it seems to me that Europe is far from a Christian continent. Christianity is just the facade, but this actual Christianity with no jealousy is very small here. And when we speak about these things, we try to blame, to find truth, and so on. I've survived all this period. I didn't even realize what happened. I didn't realize why I had to walk along the streets together with cars, carriages, and so on, and why we were closed up in ghetto. But I do understand what attitude was prevalent in 1940 and 1941. I understand that Lithuanians were exiled to gulags because of Jews. The Jews are to blame. Jews are well off. And Professor Dieckmann mentioned a number of things that were spoken about the Jews. And Lithuanians might have believed this. And the first exiles that took place in 1941, and 30% of these people were Jews, and nobody speaks about it. And now their names are already remembered. But in the national consciousness and memory, there is an understanding that the Jews were the ones who exiled, and they are to blame for all the bad things that happened. What you have to do is to be intelligent and not surrender to this ideologization, and we have to be critical with regard to the past and the present too. This is it in brief.
Professor Tomas Venclova, everybody knows you, but I will remind you that you are professor at the Illinois University. You are an intellectual, and probably everybody knows you here. And many people have read your works, your books that relate to history. We, as amateurs, know certain things, but you are an expert and professional in history. I believe that you have many ideas to share. I believe that you have already read a book by Professor Dieckmann, and you have also written a number of books about Vilnius, about Lithuania's history. I would like to ask you, or maybe you would like to share your impressions about the book. You are very welcome to do so. But I still would rather like to highlight what Professor writes about in his book prior to the Nazi occupation, the period when many people in Lithuania were affected ideologically by certain organizations. They were trained and prepared. So could you please compare the situation to the situation we have in today's Lithuania, if that is comparable at all? I don't really want to say that, you know, there were certain organizations that I don't want to attribute anyone to categories. But we in Lithuania often hear from the law enforcement institutions because of hate speech or various public announcements or falsifications of truth, or because somebody drives in the Wehrmacht uniform in around the city. Which that is prohibited. So we face that every day. I don't really want to put fuel to fire, but I believe that many people have democratic views, but we still live in the 21st century. We live in a free country, in a free democratic country. If I'm not committing a crime by asking and saying something, and only that limits my speech. So I probably have this opportunity and freedom to ask, and the right to ask, how do you see the current situation in Lithuania, bearing in mind the organization Pro Patria and etc.? If I may, I will briefly say, I want to say something about Tomas Venclova. Maybe not everybody knows it so well. Tomas Venclova is the consciousness of Lithuania. He has been writing about the Jewish issues, I think, since 1978, if I'm not mistaken, 1973 even. And those publications were all over. And Jona Šimaitė has even published it in her memoirs in Yiddish language. So this is one of the brightest personalities in Lithuania. If you read any of his books, or Lithuanian history, for instance, I'm not sure if Professor Dieckmann has read it. I know that Professor Dieckmann knows Lithuanian and can read in Lithuanian, so you will see how he sees Lithuanian history, what is his perspective of Lithuanian history. I'm sorry for interfering, but I wanted to add this. My microphone works, right? You can hear me. You see, in Lithuania, there's a saying and an opinion that is rather widespread, that there are two narratives. One is the Jewish narrative, that, let's say, Jewish come together in the Jewish museum or in a synagogue, and they are talking about all the misfortunes of the other Jewish people. Another narrative is that we Lithuanians gather ourselves in Lithuanian institutions where we talk about our own problems, about how Lithuania suffered during the because of Bolshevism, because of the Soviet activities, how we fought the Nazis during the Nazi era by publishing various underground publications and advocating against joining the SS. But we also have a different opinion that those two narratives are uncomparable, and historical narratives are often uncomparable, and they cannot be merged. So there's no Jewish narrative, there's no Lithuanian narrative. There is an honest narrative and dishonest narrative. And all of my life, well, my conscious life, all of my conscious life, I think maybe around the age of 20, when I turned 20, I tried to follow this honest narrative and to support this honest narrative. So honest narrative may be Lithuanian or Jewish. It is one single narrative that is in line with the truth, which tells about what happened in reality. It is not aiming at justifying or blaming someone. It's not attempting to do anything. It aims to tell the truth. And that is tough. What is the likelihood that an honest narrative in Lithuania would win? For over 40 years, I think this is the Sisyphus task. You keep rolling up the stone up the mountain, and it falls down again because somebody starts talking about the national vision, the national mission, and somewhere in the comments online you find some anti-Semite comments. And then you have to keep rolling that stone up again. So I had this similar feeling during the Soviet era, too, when I had to keep working on the same things. Luckily, the Soviet era is over, and I really hope that this honest narrative will become dominant without without trying to do oneself out of the situation, without any speculations of the suffering that is true and undoubted. We cannot speculate anyone's suffering, because it becomes offensive. Many people speculate on their sufferings, and that is their business. Our business is to talk about our problems, not about problems of the others. I recently read a saying that in order to introduce democracy in a country, in order to introduce democracy in politics, you need some 6 months. In Lithuania, this happened, and we know this, and we have democracy in Lithuania. In order to bring economy in order, you need some 6 years. And we more or less have this in Lithuania. We see how economically developed many Lithuanians are, how people are managing themselves on economic terms, the situation is rather favorable, and it's okay. In order to bring and to motivate civil society, you need some 60 years. I will not live long enough to see that, but I hope that our younger generation will see that moment. However, I migrated many years ago, emigrated many years ago. I got back from emigration a year and a half ago. I decided to finish my life here, where I started it, in Lithuania. I remember, before my emigration, I have read Soviet newspapers. I was listening to Soviet radio, and my views were becoming more and more right-wing views. And before I left, my political position was on the side of Mykolas Krupavičius and Mykolas Valdemaras. I really hated the system that we had in place. When I returned, I read Lithuanian newspapers, listen to Lithuanian radio, read the news portals in Lithuanian, and I am surprised that I'm becoming more leftist now. Now, I'm on the side of Kazimieras Grinius and Mykolas Šleževičius, or maybe even in the position of Antsevičius, because I see the very same procedure happening, the very same brainwashing, the brainwashing practice, the same practice. But now the brainwashing is done in the media, online, especially on Delphi, where there are the right parties which blame the Soviets or the Soviet era, and you would rarely see any left comments in Delphi. This kind of brainwashing, which starts in school, which starts in the army, any kind of brainwashing, to me, whether that is Soviet or anti-Soviet, whether it's red or tricolor, to me, it is something intolerable. I am really allergic to that. People should not be brainwashed. People should be skeptical and thinking. They have to think hard. And these are our major problems that we have now. There was a question about interim government, about the Vilnius Lithuanian Committee, and about the uprising of June that was mentioned. I'm sorry, that was commemorated in a rather solemn manner, but we did not really see it this year. We haven't noticed it this year. Almost the very same day and almost in the very same place, Irena Veisaitė was awarded with a German order. Those who were calling for tolerance, I think, and that the event where Professor Veisaitė was awarded a German medal, a German order, was attended by many more people than the commemoration of the uprising of June. Former President Adamkus attended the event. I think he's the best president of all we had. Kazimieras Grinius was a rather good president also. But his rule lasted for a very short period of time, and he was removed from his position, so I don't really value him as much as I value President Adamkus. You know, people say that we still respect them. They may have made some errors and mistakes. Many of them were invented, and that is the Putin's propaganda. But they were the ones who were fighting against the Bolshevism, who were fighting for the freedom of Lithuania. Okay, I can also say that Nazis were fighting against the Bolshevism too, bloody Bolshevism, by staining themselves in blood even more than Bolsheviks themselves. Of course, Nazis were more educated and better and more intellectual. That is the typical brainwashing that we get. In the Soviet era, we were taught something different. We were listening to a different line of propaganda. Yes, Nazis were fighting against the Bolsheviks, and some of them died. Many of them died, to be correct. They were in favor for Lithuanians' freedom. Nazis were fighting for German freedom, and they have died for the freedom of Germany. But the German nation are not really admiring them, is not commemorating them and not celebrating their lives. Yes, somebody mentioned that I have written two books of Lithuanian history. The second book was published 6 months ago. Probably not every one of you managed to read it, I think, but I tried to present my perspective and to those issues. And I would like to quote as a historian, without judging, I would like to quote some historical documents. There is such a historical document by Kazys Škirpa, a letter to Antanas Smetona, the president. I'm not sure what year it was written. It was written in 1940, I think, when Lithuania's independence was destroyed and Lithuania was already occupied. That letter was printed in historical books that nobody knows and nobody reads. My book, I think, is more popular, and I hope that somebody may even read it. So this sounds as follows. It doesn't matter how the party is called in Lithuanian, the one that says that follows Hitler. They may be referred to as activists or some other name. Yes, they later were referred to the Lithuanian Activist Front. But the most important is the principle of the leader and arranging the society according to National Socialist principles. All the Lithuanian parties have to disappear because they all are corrupt. And out of this rubbish, the new party, a courageous party, will turn up. That is Lithuanian National Socialist Party. So that is an open program of Lithuanian neo-Nazism. And I'm not sure why Lithuanian Nazis are better than German Nazis. They are not better. They did not agree with certain statements by German Nazis. They believed that Lithuania had to be run by Lithuanian Nazis, not German Nazis, but we should have the very same system like they had in Germany. I don't really agree with that. When Šimašius abolished the street name of Škirpa Street, then we heard many people contradicting the fact and protesting against that. And many people said that, you know, don't bring controversy in the society. No, there's nothing wrong with introducing controversy in the society. This is how we make people think. One more thing that I would like to quote from my Book of Lithuanian History.
Newspaper Naujoji Lietuva, 1941, the 4th of July, when the provisional government was not dissolved. It writes, today, I'm not comfortable to read this text in a synagogue. I wouldn't feel comfortable in church too. Today, the genius Adolf Hitler and the great army, thanks to them, we are free from the Soviet occupation. Some of communists, Jewish communists, are the spies of the Soviets, and that's the end for the Jews. The new Lithuania joined the new Europe of Hitler. It should be clean from Jews to, and it is the main task of the new Lithuania. Somebody told me, you know, this provisional government couldn't control everything. If at least one word was published in any newspaper against this provisional government, this would be stopped right away. But this quotation expresses the government's attitude or the majority's attitude. Well, genocide, wasn't it our genocide, the question is called, because the genocide was against us, so we did what we did. We had the massacre of Reinei. It's a tragic thing, a thing that shouldn't be forgotten. It should be commemorated, and we should remember it. How many people died there? 76. Who killed them? Those who... Domas Ročius and Raslanas, they are the ethnic Lithuanians. Nachmanas Duškanskis was blamed for it. It's sort of the person who drinks other people's blood. Dušanskis wasn't present there at that time even, irrespective of the fact that he worked for the Soviets and did a lot of bad things. There were a lot of Lithuanians who worked for Soviet security and did many bad things. But our society knows just Dušanskis in order to justify their attitude towards Jews. It was the Revenge Act in relation to Reinei, and there were more people even killed than during the massacre of Reinei, and nobody speaks about this because it's not patriotic and it serves Putin's propaganda. If Putin says that 2 times 2 is 4, I wouldn't say that it's 5. What I want to say that if we had more books like the book by Rūta Vanagaitė, Our People, it's an excellent book, and it played a very good role. And another book, the current book by Rūta Vanagaitė and Professor Dieckmann. And these books enshrine this honest narrative. And if we continue speaking about it, there is hope that in the next 60 years, okay, next 30 years, because 30 years have already passed, this local decent society will win. And the society is never decent to the very end. It becomes decent when the majority of the society is decent. This is the case in Europe, in the majority of European countries. And this will happen in Lithuania too. Thank you very much. I hope that you are not bored with our discussion. And if I may, I would give the floor to Rūta Vanagaitė, the co-author of this book, at least the one who formulated the questions. And you know that questions are very important, and we don't know answers to all of them. Rūta, the floor is yours. Hello. I will be very brief. How did this book started? When I published my book, Our People, I thought that it will be my first and last project related to the Holocaust. That after the book, which had an aim to show to Lithuanians what the Holocaust was, so that they heard and saw this tragedy, the way I felt when I wrote it and when I visited these places of massacre. The book turned to be very popular. 18,000 of copies were bought, so 100,000 of Lithuanians read it. So after Molėtai March, I believed that Lithuania will change, that new historians, writers, film producers will continue this topic and will make the Holocaust close and important for this society. But this was not the case. What happened was the Sisyphus job, and the stone fell down, and I couldn't do anything else. I'm not a historian, I'm not a journalist, I'm Putin's agent, as I was blamed it, that I did it for Putin's money, and I'm not a Jew even. And by chance, in the old town of Jerusalem, I met historian Mr. Dieckmann, Christoph Dieckmann, who has been studying this topic in a number of cases, and we were walking in the old town of Jerusalem, and we spoke about his children, my children, and then I asked several questions to him that I had after my book, because I had more questions than answers in my book, and I thought to myself, why am I speaking about my children? And I asked several questions, and he answered all my questions very simply. I am a woman which is not very well educated on the topic of the Holocaust, and he explained to me what I should do. And Christoph was sent to me by God, and God sent Christoph to Lithuania. This person knows what to say, and we have to listen to him. My generation, this applies to my generation and the next generation too. And the only problem was to convince Christoph to share his deep insights all this analysis and to convey them to non-academic community, to tell this in a simple manner. Because I had a lot of questions, and I'm sure that people who read my book, our people, came up with the same questions, and they don't hold tightly to this nationalist narrative. The second problem was, after I convinced Christoph that we can do this together, maybe not in a very simplistic manner, but in a manner that is easy to understand. The other problem was to convince him to cooperate with me, because Vanagaitė is like a red flag. I can't sell my books and so on. And why should he stain his reputation working with me? It was hard at first, but Christoph overcame both obstacles. He trusted me. We cooperated for 2 years. We have discussions for 2 years, and I've learned a lot in those 2 years. And there was a point in time when we even cried together. So I'm really grateful to Christoph for his patience, for his wisdom, for his belief in me, and I'm grateful to thousands of people, to Faina and her foundation. This book saw the daylight, and it's a very important book, and it's a gift for the next 30 years until the civil society is born in Lithuania. Thank you very much. I forgot to say and emphasize that Mr. Dieckmann is the member of the commission appointed by the government which investigates Nazi crimes. And member of the parliament, Emanuelis Zingeris, also attends this event. Maybe, Emanuelis, you would like to say a couple of words, because we will have a lot of questions afterwards.
It was an initiative of President Adamkus and Mr. Venclova, I think, and the award ceremony of Professor Veisaitė. So it was their initiative to bring together historians of the world, global historians, who would assess, alongside with Lithuanian historians, who would assess the past and would create a certain system of values, a certain system of facts that we could base ourselves upon, our modern Lithuanian society could base themselves upon, to understand why we were fighting for Lithuania in the Western world. So these historians are the promoters of Western values. We see how tough it is, how difficult it is to perceive all of the events that happened after the war, during the war, how difficult all the societies receive it in Poland, in Germany, what contradictions we have to face in the societies. And we see that in our society, Madam Faina and Mr. Ambassador, we suffer from the huge fact that over 200,000 have died. They are not a power to our Lithuanian society, and the decency that Professor Venclova said is not only related to the elections, but it also is related to inclusion of people, of the collaborators into our modern society. What can we do when in New York, in Israel, in France, partially, we have political will and political power, that is the Jewish community and society, which votes for different parties. But here in Lithuania, we don't have such a Jewish society which would vote. So here we try to appeal the decency of our society. there is no political power of Jews. You know, the largest number of Jews who died in Europe was in Lithuania. That is 94%. We don't have the people who voted before the war in the elections. We no longer have them. We need to have a part of the society that would, after leaving the synagogue, would continue to do this thing that we did before the war. So we really hope, Faina, that you have supported the Commission and those decent, honest historians from the Commission, and we finally have published these books. I truly hope that this truth will reach all the voters in Lithuania. I would like to thank a couple of politicians who are here together with us in the audience. There are very few of them among us, but they are still here today. Thank you. Now, I would like to ask if there's anyone willing to ask a question to the author, or if you have a question to anyone else in the panel, please. I would like to say a few words about the importance of this book. History makes an impact on people's mentality, on their experience, on their collective experiences and their collective mentality. Especially, it has a huge impact on those who went through that history, who had experienced the history themselves. When those who experience that history leave, here is the point where politics starts. Professor, you mentioned that in Lithuania there are very few of those so-called right-wing radicals, but they have their people, their representatives in the parliament, and that is true. Those radicals never exceed 0.1% in Lithuania, luckily. I'm not sure what the future elections will be, but they still have their representatives in the parliament. So we have a member in the Christian and Democratic Party. Why I make this introduction into talking about the importance of your book? Why this book is so important? We just saw a direct attack against Rūta Vanagaitė from one of the right-wing ideologists from the parliament, who were very indecently attacking Rūta Vanagaitė. The question is why, and my answer is that in the media, in the Delphi news portal, was that you were scared of the truth. This book matters because it is based on facts, it is based on analysis, and it is also based on a human, professional analysis by an expert, prominent, world-recognized expert. So, moreover, the debate on the role of leaders of the Lithuania of the past and their decisions led to the Holocaust. It did not prevent the Holocaust. So all the sequence is presented in a very clear manner in this book. So thank you very much for this. Mr. Dieckmann, your opinion, what is your opinion? How important the prehistory of the Holocaust is in Lithuania? What assumptions, what reasons led to the Holocaust? And how do you think are they important in the modern debate on Lithuania's shame, on the greatest shame of Lithuania? How do you see it? Thank you, Arkadiusz. we would like to ask Professor Dieckmann to respond, but in the future, I'm a polite person and I do not interrupt. What you have said is really meaningful and very important, but we have very little time and we have so much to say. So let us not say, but ask instead. I hope that Mr. Dieckmann is not visiting Lithuania very last time. He may come to Lithuania many more times. Maybe we'll have another debate. And then we will be able to share our opinions. And we'll ask longer questions. But now I would like to ask you to be brief as possible.
I followed the question, yes. Because we have wonderful translators. Many thanks. It goes very well. So let's start from the end. If I were religious, I would say I would pray that this book is an opener and not an end. That it opens a discussion. What is the relevance of history for any society, for the Lithuanian society, for the German society? The relevance is us. That we take knowledge, that we learn and we continue to do that. And then I would even claim, even automatically, we improve how we make our assessment of the present situations and our choices. Yeah? So it's not so much now we have a tool and we implement it, yeah? Like pedagogy or something. No, it's a constant process of we need to strengthen civic democratic society. That's our problem. And our opponents are not really fascists. Yeah? They are more ethnic nationalists. We have two camps. Very often the debate is between those two. Now, in Germany, you mentioned the right-wing anti-Semites in Lithuania. In Germany, we have constantly at least 5% strong anti-Semites. 5%, constantly. Yeah? That is from 45 through till today. That is with 80 million people, that's a lot. Yeah? That's about 4 million people, which we don't really like. And they are not sort of vague, no, but they are on the far right end. In 1946, we had 80% of the German population anti-Semites. 80%, American surveys. Yeah? Today it's about 20-25 with this hardcore vision of 5%. So they are there. Yeah? And we will not convince them. We will not convince them to change their mind because they have their vision of how to explain the world. Our problem is the 80-90 other % of our society. And here history and talking about history and discussing what happened and why and what can we learn from it and where do we have to continue with our research, etc., etc. This is what this is about. And I pray that this book, as Musiškai, now will continue to that. It means there are lots of mistakes in Musiškai. We find lots of mistakes in this one, and for the next 200 years we will find lots of mistakes. Yeah? But that is good. Yeah? That is good. It's not like this will continue. This will continue. Now, the question was about the prehistory of the Shoah in Lithuania. The huge question. Yeah? My point of view would be the latest point to start is 1918. Latest point to start is 1918, and the reaction in Europe to the First World War. That is a starting point of everything that happens basically until the 1990s. Nazis and Bolsheviks were an answer, in a way, sort of became strong because of World War I. Both. And they celebrated basically the end of democratic capitalist societies. The future, it's hard for us today to imagine, but the future was either with the Bolsheviks or with the fascists. That was all the democracies that were there. They were gone. They were newly created in the 1920s. Were gone by the 1930s. Almost all of them. And replaced by authoritarian regimes and by two fascist regimes, Italy and Germany. So I would start there and then have the eyes very open for the development in all of Europe. If we look at that like from a narrow nationalistic perspective, we won't understand anything. Yeah? So I would start from there and then open up the whole thing. Yeah? So when you get the long version of my study, you will have to go through 300 pages prehistory. Yeah? And again, because the different narratives are there. No? Thomas Venclova mentioned that. We have the Lithuanian narrative, and there it's in plural. We have narratives. Yeah? We have the Jewish narratives about the time, and of course we have the German narratives, and we have the historiography on all of that. Yeah? So the survey on research in my book, it's about 40 pages alone till 2008. 40 pages alone, just to recapitulate what was happening. So that I would say, and I would, shame, that's a big word. And it's a very important word, and it's much more important for me than guilt. Yeah, because guilt is a judicial term, and shame is a reaction to something this shouldn't have happened out of a cultural moral codex. Yeah? So, and the question of shame remains open, I believe, but we have to sort of use it as a lens to go through all of this, and on all sides. Yeah? So I would very much in favor of using a weird category as shame to inform our questions and our searching. I'm very much in favor of that, actually. So actually, in the Lithuanian variant of this book, sometimes the book guilt, the shame was replaced by guilt. I said, no, change it back. Change it back. Yeah, because it is so important. Yeah. Am I allowed 2 more sentences? Yeah. 4041, which is so crucial for the ethnic Lithuanian narrative of this. And now we're here in the Jewish community in the synagogue. But nevertheless, I would like to emphasize this. Anti-Semitism, if I want to explain it, it's a trap if I look at the Jews. Yeah? If I want to explain anti-Semitism by looking at Jewish Bolsheviks, I will never find an answer. Anti-Semitism is a problem. We have to look at the anti-Semites. Yeah? So anti-Semitism is a problem if we want to understand what why anti-Semitism changes over time, why it becomes stronger, why it becomes violent, why it becomes less, why it has this notion and this notion. Forget about the Jews, they're not important here. Yeah? It's about those groups who promote that, who invest in this, who take this as a system of explaining to themselves the world. If Lithuanians take in the summer of 41 rabbis, traditional rabbis, and have them carry pictures of Lenin and Stalin through the villages and shtetls and marketplaces, you ask yourself, what is this all about? And it's clearly not about the behavior of the rabbi. Yeah? It's about those ethnic Lithuanian spectators who want to achieve something here. But what? What is it? Yeah? Collaboration comes in. Again, maybe part of this is the engagement with the Soviet regime as Lithuanians, which is now all of a sudden that the Germans are here. It's shameful. And we have to get rid of this shame. And how do we get rid of the shame? We blame the Jews. They externalize what was bad last year and put it on them, and then we get rid of it. Yeah? And we have a lot of cases who carry it on both shoulders. We were first collaborating with the Soviets, then collaborating with the Nazis, even though the Germans didn't want former Bolsheviks, but they didn't know really. Yeah? So this is an important. So anti-Semitism is a topic actually much more for the to analyze. We have to look at the anti-Semites and not the Jews. Yeah? Then a short remark on, it was mentioned that the provisional government formed by the LAF, the Lithuanian Activist Front, and the LNP, the Lithuanian Fascists. Two different things. The provisional government was not formed by the LNP, but by the LAF. And the LAF was much more inclusive and much more open and wide than the LNP. The LNP was first outside and then pushed into the government and into the police and military functions with the help of the Gestapo in the second half of July. This is important. So there is no clear, no straight line from Ambrazavicius to Barsta. There's no straight line. It's crooked. Yeah, and we have to understand that. And then we can also look at the discussion on Ambrazavicius, the provisional prime minister of the provisional government, in a different way. Yeah? Not to sort of say, oh, Ambrazavicius wasn't that bad. No, but he followed a different logic. And that's the historical point. He followed a different logic than people like Noreika, like Basta, etc. Yeah? That is important. Maybe one last remark. Rūta. Yes, Rūta, because when Rūta, I met Rūta first time in Warsaw on a conference, and she just kept sort of, kind of ran after me. Yeah? And why? Because, and I heard about her, of course, yeah? And I didn't like Zurov, yeah? And you were together, this book, and oh, come on, yeah? Stop annoying me, so to speak, kind of, yeah? But I told you I'm a 100% skeptical person. I don't believe rumors. I'm basing what I think and what on my own experiences. And this woman, I don't know about her prehistory, but from the history she has with me, is she wants to know. She wants to understand. Yeah? And to find ethnic Lithuanians who really want to know is not so easy, as we all know. Right? And this woman just kept asking. Yeah? And when I said answers which she didn't like, she said, gee, yeah? But she didn't run away or something, no? And so she was so engaged, not with me or with doing something, but with history, with her family history. And then this woman didn't go to monuments for Lithuanian heroes, she went to the mass graves. Yeah. And so I said, okay, we give it a chance. Yeah, we give it a chance. So, and then I was persuaded, and I'm happy to say that publicly, by the honesty of the questions and the honest search for history in this country. Yeah? And I know that a lot of the rumors about her, what Tadek creates, is blank nonsense. How rich we are, and in which sort of service we are, and all that is bullshit. I'm sorry to say it in a religious place. Yeah? So, and that's why I want to thank you, Rūta, yeah, for having initiated this, and our cooperation will hopefully continue. Thank you very much.
Here we go. As an expert of languages, I would like to ask a linguistic question, a very easy one for everyone to relax. I know that Rūta has made an introduction for this book, and Christoph worked in 6 archives of 6 countries, and he had to learn the languages, including Lithuanian. So how you managed to learn Lithuanian to be able to read those documents? Thank you.
I emphasize the issue of languages for if you want to look at this multinational history. There's no way of writing a good history of the Shoah in any place in Europe without knowing all the languages of the groups involved which are acting and which I want to look at. So unfortunately, I don't have Polish. Yeah? So for the Vilnius area, the parts are weak because they leave out the Polish side, even though they were sort of like more than 1/3 of the city population. But the way to deal with that is then not to cover it, but to say, I can't do that because I can't read their sources. Yeah? So I need to read for sort of maybe almost half of the book. I tried to, and that was the hardest part actually, harder than the German part, harder than the Lithuanian part, is the Jewish part. To write this history from the perspective of the Jews in Lithuania, based on those sources. And in which language is that written? Did I go to the English translations? No, they are very often bad and abbreviated. Yeah? So you go to the Yiddish. And that is the early reports we have, the early books, the early chapters. They are the best source and also methodologically. People like Philip Friedman are the true Holocaust founders of Holocaust research. Yeah? Because they had an inclusive approach, spoke all the languages, and did that. Yeah? So for Lithuania important are people like Josef Gar, for example, who wrote a wonderful history in the DP camp on the Kovno ghetto, which is the best story we have, the best history we have. Yeah? But this is in Yiddish. So the most important thing was to learn, if I want to write the perspective include the victim's view, I need to know how to, I need to include Yiddish sources. A little bit of Ivrit, of Hebrew, yeah? And a little bit of other, but mostly Yiddish and Ivrit. So this is important. Now, if I'm serious with putting the focus not on Berlin, but on Vilna, Kaunas, Šiauliai, Trakai, Reine, whatever, yeah? I need to know, and then I get to the place and I see there's, we have here 1 million, 1 million people in the northern province of Šiauliai, and we have only 8 Germans here who are acting. What do I need to look at? The records of the county police chiefs and the county politics chiefs. In which language are those? Some reports are in German, then okay, sent to Kaunas, but most of it is in Lithuanian. Yeah? So what do? I say, okay, I'm not going to touch that. Then I have to stop my research, or I have to change my question and say, okay, I'm going to look only at the Germans and the Jews and leave the Lithuanians out. And many people don't do that. They continue and then replicate the Gestapo version of the Lithuanian behavior, or the SS version from the German political civic command, which was then most of the time here for 3 years. Yeah? And then they just copy what is in the German records, which is of course nonsense. That is not history. Yeah? It's just a sort of reclamation of the version of, sort of as if you say, is this all written on the basis of KGB material? No, you can't write a history like that. You can't. And so if I, and since I was serious with what I wanted to find out, I had to learn that. And how do you learn languages? You just learn them. Yeah, you go to courses, you use a dictionary, you're patient. Yeah? And the more languages you learn, the easier it gets. Yeah? And here you still know it because many of you speak several languages, right? And fluently. Yeah? Polish, Lithuanian, Russian, English, at least. Yeah? Some of you even German and Yiddish. Yeah? So you know much better what I'm talking about than I do. Okay? So, and what I would stress is this is a basic precondition for being good, for delivering good historical work. Okay?
Professor, I would like to make a statement, a very short one, and a question, and one question. First of all, I would like, on behalf of the first generation of victims, to thank the Germans and Lithuanians who saved Jews. My mother was saved by a German. The next thing I would like, and they were really angels sent from God. Now you and Rūta are the angels of truth, and I would like to thank you. And the question that I have is, unfortunately, it sounds a material question, and I don't want anyone to accuse Jews to only care for money. Just an issue of basically also part of the truth. I would like to know, since Lithuanians and the Germans were really partners, not collaborators. Reading from your book, I got the feeling that they're really partners. And partnership can be different kinds. Can be 70-30%, can be 50-50, can be 90-10, and partnerships can have at some point mutual interest, and then the partnership sometimes divorce. My question is how the German side partnership reacted, the society after the war, to reparations and restitution. How the German society, even up to now, reacts and feels about this issue.
You want to answer?
Yes, so we take questions.
Okay.
I have also read the book. I know that very few who are here have read the books, but I have 3 very short questions to you. And one observation. You write about the crimes of the Russian Empire and the Russian military administration, imperial administration, I'm sorry. I think you should have rather said that those were the crimes by the Kaiser army in Lithuania, and even more precise, I think if you started from about the concentration lagers, about the experiments, and etc. That is my short observation. And then my question is, did you know, or did Nazi administration know, and well, their collaborators, Lithuanians and of people of other ethnicities, that they know that they will be killing Jews, men, women, and children? That is one of my questions. And my second question is, the first killings in the province, before the German administrations were launched in the provinces, were the killings organized as well? I thank those 2 men who asked the questions. I will ask the professor to respond, and I will also ask to finish our debate on this point, because we are already taking a bit too long. I think that many of you will be able to get the contacts of the professor and will be able to write him. If you want your copy of the book to be signed, so please be patient to wait for us to answer these 2 questions, and you will have an opportunity. And this is how we conclude our meeting today.
Leonas, I must contradict you. We are not angels of truth. We are not angels of truth. We're just normal people trying to find out what happened and why. So I would sort of favor a much more low-key tone here. Yeah? We're just doing normal stuff. Yeah? And that in a decent way. Yeah? And to angels possess the wisdom, and then they... No. This is about asking questions. I'm serious about this. This is about asking questions. And we need to learn to discuss and listen. Listen to each other as well. And to the ones we don't like, especially. So this is also much about listening. That's one thing. Then the question about restitution. Huge topic. Another shameful history, actually. We can't go into details now here. Yeah? Each country has its own history of restitution. So I actually don't really know what to say. Like, I can't tell the story now because. It's difficult because after the war was lost, what were the questions of the Germans were, of course, why did we lose this war? Why did it go wrong a second time? So you would explain this to yourself by the worldview you would have before and during this war as well. So first of all, the Jews were too strong in this one, behind the Allies. Yeah? And now they're coming and even want what we just took because if you expropriate Jews, you don't do it because you're greedy. No. You do it because you believe that they robbed it from you, and so the true owner takes back what he wants. Yeah? So anti-Semites would react like that. No, it's another story. Now, in Germany, a lot of restitution actually took place in a completely twisted way because many of the judges, of the bureaucrats, which were now supposed to give the property back, were involved in getting it, stealing it from them in the first place. Yeah? Stealing it from them in the first place. So we have many stories about this, so completely awkward situations. Yeah? And even first judges or first attorneys who were investigating Nazi crimes were themselves in the Nazi party, and etc., etc. We learn about it only much later. So it's a completely complicated story. There's so much stories to tell here. Yeah? So you asked about the First World War. Yes, when the Germans, because that is of course a wonderful model to look at, 1915 to 18, Germans are occupying this region. So it's lovely to compare that. Similarities and differences between 15 to 18 and 41 to 44. Yeah, what is different? And the main difference is, of course, the anti-Semitism. Yeah, and of course the warfare. The warfare which then dominated the structure of the occupation policy, which then dominated the policy against the local populations. Now, what was most interesting for writing this study, and it is also in this book, I believe, is I'm emphasizing always this notion of experiences and expectations. Now, in 41, many elderly Jews remembered, of course, the Germans here in 1915 to 18. Yeah? And they would say it was hard. Yeah? And we suffered from hunger, we were forced labor, a lot of things. But the real bad ones were the Cossacks from the Tsarist army. They were the ones who executed then the deportation from this area. About 120,000 Jews were deported and then came back. Many of them came back in the early 20s. And they were so violent. So anti-Jewish violence comes mainly from forces outside. And those were not the Germans. Even though we find a lot of anti-Semitism in the German documents from the time, but the remembrance of the Jews here in 40-41, when the Germans came in, was not, we have to run from them immediately. No. The younger generation said, yes, we have to run immediately. Yeah? But the elderly said, no, the price is too high, we stay. Yeah? That's one thing. Then, violence in the provinces, very important topic, yeah, because it comes up again and again and again. And within the Commission and within our own research, we did that many times. We tried to find those places where before the Germans came in, massive violence took place against Jews, to identify those places in an empirical way. And there are only very few. Yeah? If you look at that in a broader picture, if you could sort of look for pogroms like the ones in Kaunas, where you have 1,000 victims in Viljandpolje and a few dozens in other places, like in Jetukis, one on the Jonava Bridge. Yeah? If you compare that to what happens in Utina, in Ukmergė, in Alytus, in whatever, in Rūkiškis, it's on a completely different level. Yeah? So what you have very often in cooperation with the Germans even before the war, chasing of Jewish men and trying to identify them and to isolate them, because they were the first targets of the German policy, of the German terrorist policy of decapitating the Soviet system. And the Germans were anti-Semites, as we know, so their view of accelerating this war was to decapitate the Soviet leadership, and this included Jewish men. And that was behind the murder of 20,000 of Jewish men in the first few weeks of this war. It was not a plan to kill all Jews immediately. Then the Germans expected, we have finished this war in the autumn, and then we will see. And most the projects we have from German documents from the time was to deport all Jews under German control into territories which were then very bad to live in, and Jews would die out within one generation. Be it Madagascar, be it Magnitogorsk, the channel, the Gulag, basically, in the north of the Soviet Union. So we don't have a plan to kill all Jews in 1941. And this is very complicated to realize when you look in hindsight at what happened. But when you look at it from the time and day by day, which we did, yeah, that's the way it was. And the choices those Germans made at the time were not conditioned by when do we implement our plan to kill all of them? No. No? Their question was, how do we ease this warfare and how do we create an occupation policy which is functional for us and will help in erecting the German empire. Not only the German nation, but the German empire. Yeah? So it's hard to understand, but that's what is based on the sources. So I hope I covered that. We conclude now.
Yes, I would like
Now I'd like to thank, of course, the author of the book, and to conclude this meeting at the synagogue, where the walls should protect us. Unfortunately, they failed to protect us many times. On the contrary, we had experienced sufferings here. But I truly hope that this event will not cause any discontent in the society or will not be misperceived, or we as community will not receive any negative comments. We are talking of the issues that we should be talking of after the war, and we will continue to talk about these issues. But this leads us to the very final point, to the very final conclusions that we have to make. Education, education, and education. We need to educate people. We need to work for that. We need to publish these kind of books. We need to have discussions like today. Otherwise, criminals will be glorified, and we will continue talking for 70 years about the restitution of property, about restoration of civil rights, because I don't know any document, or maybe I haven't seen one, maybe I'm not educated enough to see the document which would restore my parents or your parents, Irena, rights that were taken away when the war broke out. What document is that? I don't know, yes, so there is no such a document. So our rights comprise many aspects. Of course, nobody persecutes us any longer. Nobody calls us Jews on the street. But I would like to see such a document that would finalize and envisage my right as a citizen and the rights of my parents. No, Iran, I think you are talking about something different. What about those who escaped from the concentration camps to Palestine? Professor Vanagaitė says that she has no intentions of claiming any rights. Well, okay, you may want it or not. I'm very grateful to everyone. I'm extremely grateful to the author and everyone who had patience to sit and listen here. I hope you found interesting material here. We will continue talking about this topic on every opportunity we can. Thank you very much.